obviously we know that we're in the middle of our own recovery situation. And so the idea of sort of the larger impacts and issues that are arising because of climate disasters and disasters of all sorts and kinds of sort of part of what we're living through right now. But even more broadly than that, we know that those are risks that are just sort of overtaking lots of communities around the world. In addition to that, I think we're also really excited to sort of learn about different sort of methodological approaches and ideas of sort of centering different voices in those sorts of conversations. And so, as I think a lot of you are probably aware of, and I think part of our sort of our equity-driven approach in our department, our school, is really interesting sort of thinking about the ways that we can think about how to center voices of folks that are impacted as they're dealing with these different sorts of environmental issues into the conversation. And so just to give a little bit of additional info about Anna. Anna is a researcher and educator, arts manager, and theater maker based in Melbourne, Australia. She is currently completing her doctorate of philosophy and arts at the University of Melbourne, where she researches community-engaged arts programs following disasters that improve psychological well-being. Anna is recognized as an expert in the field, frequently presenting at national and international conferences, industry events, and in the media. So if everyone could join me in giving a round of applause and thanking Anna for being with us.
Thanks for that really warm introduction. I'm really glad to be here to share with you. I just want to take a moment as well to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on, and also extend that acknowledgement to the First Peoples of the lands that I conduct my work on, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I think it's really important in a conversation on culture and the arts and the environment and disasters, and also in an environment of knowledge sharing and exchange. As was already mentioned, I'm in the final stages of my PhD at the University of Melbourne. My usual research disciplines are arts and cultural management, community arts and fine arts practice, and also disaster studies from a public health perspective. So I use this interdisciplinary lens to examine what we in Australia call creative recovery. So most of you have probably heard that term used here in LA and in the US more broadly to describe the recovery of the cultural sector or the creative sector from COVID and from other disasters. But in Australia, we use this term to describe community-focused or community-engaged arts projects. So if I use that term creative recovery, that's what I'm referring to today. So today I'll present some case studies from my research of these kinds of projects. And I hope that'll inspire some more thinking about how the arts and culture can enhance wildfire recovery processes here in LA. So presenting here in the context of public planning and public policy is a bit of a sidestep from my usual approach. So I really invite you to bring your own lenses and planning considerations to this presentation as well, and particularly in the questions at the end. I'm really happy to try and respond to anything that comes up for you that I can. But overall, my intention is to really provide some clear examples about how artistic projects are developed in and with communities as part of the disaster recovery process, and to offer some insights into how this might interact with planning processes a bit more broadly. So while my cases are from Australia, there are many potentially transferable learnings to given the similarities between our cultures and environmental landscapes as well. Watching the recent LA wildfires unfold from Australia, my mind was immediately brought back to our catastrophic 2009 Black Saturday bushfires, and also more recently the 2019-2020 summer wildfires. Between August 2019 and March 2020, 73,360 square miles of land burned. So for comparison, that's about half the size of the state of California. Tens of thousands of people were displaced, 3,000 homes were destroyed, and 33 people lost their lives. So I know firsthand how confronting it can be to reflect on the impacts of disasters on communities, whether you consider yourself personally impacted or not. So please look after yourselves during this presentation. If you need to take a break or go for a walk, get some air, have a sip of water, I won't be offended if you take a sip out. Like California, the state of Victoria in Australia, where I live, is one of the most wildfire-prone regions in the world. As I said before, this reputation was cemented internationally after Black Saturday, which until recently was widely regarded as the worst disaster in Australia's history. In 2009, on Saturday, 7th of February, up to 400 individual fires broke out across Victoria, burning more than 1,737 square miles, destroying over 2,000 homes and killing 173 people. Lesser known is that following this catastrophic event, multiple creative projects were instigated by artists, community members and community groups throughout the state. I first became aware of these projects when I was working for a rural non-profit arts organisation called Regional Arts Victoria. And years after Black Saturday, I was tasked with organising a staff trip to the small town of Strathewen, which was heavily impacted by Black Saturday and has a population of around 200 people. During Black Saturday, 29 people from Strathewen lost their lives. So I'm sure you can imagine the impact that that had on the community. As my colleagues and I drove into town 8 years after the fires, we noticed mosaic mailboxes lining the streets. In reading research reports later, I found out that following Black Saturday, a group of Strathewen locals met weekly to create 60 mailboxes for their fellow community members, bringing colour back to their blackened streets and replacing the letterboxes that had been lost in the fires. Past the street of mailboxes was the memorial site, where an enormous silvery lifelike eucalyptus tree had been erected. This is where I first met artist project manager Amanda Grant, who I later interviewed about her experience leading the project. She explained that the project began as a series of leaf forging workshops with fire-affected community members, many of which took place at community markets on the weekends. Initially, she had envisaged a 6-month project that would result in a small sculpture as a gift to the fire-affected community. But ultimately, the tree was constructed over a period of 5 years, with community members and recovery workers contributing over 1,500 names and personal messages stamped on the steel and copper leaves for the canopy. Altogether, 3,500 leaves were made, with approximately 1,000 of these donated from blacksmiths from 28 different countries. Amanda and her team quickly realised that they need to expand their vision beyond a small sculpture and instead set out to construct a life-sized stainless steel tree sculpture that could support the weight of all the leaves. To pay for materials and installation, Amanda and her team raised funds through sponsorship and donations from multiple private companies and non-profit organisations. They also formed welding groups to upskill local community members to weld the leaves onto the branches and the branches onto the tree. Community members and other supporters of the project noted the tree's importance to community members affected by Black Saturday, both directly and indirectly. The tree project helped develop networks within the fire-affected region and increased feelings of belonging for community members who came together to participate in creative group activities. The project also established relationships between community members, recovery organisations and government, building social capital. Amanda said that at last count, the Tree Project team had worked with 100 different organisations across sectors. The Tree continues to inspire sister projects today, with a community tree project underway in Cobargo, New South Wales, in response to the Black Summer wildfires more recently. Slightly behind the blacksmith's tree in Strathewen, somewhat hidden by other real eucalyptus trees, is another memorial, which my colleagues and I also visited. Barbara, a local artist and member of the Strathewen Community Recovery Association, explained to my colleagues and I how community members' words had been incorporated in this memorial, chiselled into the orangey stone encircling 4 large metal water droplets. My colleagues and I walked through the memorial, reading the words the people of Strathewen had written about their lives before, during and after the fires. We kept our sunglasses on, stoically concealing our tears as we read profound statements of loss and of hope for the future, despite what the community had been through. In 2023, I visited Strathewen again to conduct a focus group with a group of women who had participated in these and other artistic projects following Black Saturday. 14 years later, they were still meeting on a weekly basis to create art alongside one another. The strength of their bonds was a testament to how the arts can bring people together after disasters, providing an important avenue for social connection that can extend far beyond the recovery period. One woman even said to me that she didn't think she and the other women would have survived without the arts projects. Witnessing the creative recovery of Strathewen inspired me to write a master's thesis and then go on to write a doctoral thesis on community arts programs after disasters. You might have also heard these kinds of programs referred to as socially engaged arts or community cultural development, placemaking or other similar terms. I won't get into the differences here, but I'll just emphasise the point that these creative recovery projects all involve collaboration with or leadership by community members, and that's the kind of unifying characteristic of these projects. And the reason that these collaborations take place is so that the artworks that are created and the processes that are used are relevant and meaningful to community members participating in these kinds of projects. I also think to understand the significance of these projects, it's important to reflect on the impact that disasters can have on communities in the first instance. Anyone who's read Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell will be familiar with her utopic vision of civic mindedness after disasters. And she frames this vision in contrast to those in popular culture which portray victims of disasters as panicked and disorderly, pushing each other out of the way during disasters. And what Solnit points out is true. We're actually more likely to spontaneously respond in ways that help and protect our neighbours. For example, in Lismore, a city affected by major floods in 2022, 50 civilians spontaneously coordinated the rescue of approximately 1,000 fellow community members. Realising that emergency services had been overwhelmed by demand, Lismore community members used social media to identify who needed help escaping from their rooftops, then deployed fellow community members on rescue missions on a combination of small boats, jet skis and kayaks. Experiences like this can contribute to an experience of intense bonding, or what trauma psychologist Rob Gordon calls social fusion, as people collectively respond to their most pressing needs together as a community. However, after the initial period of adrenaline and bonding has subsided, this sense of community spirit can begin to wane. This is especially challenging for those who already experienced social and economic inequalities prior to the disaster, as they typically have less power and fewer resources to help them recover in the aftermath. Disaster sociologist Laurie Peake and her collaborators found that disaster losses tend to be distributed along the familiar lines of race, ethnicity, gender, social class, and age. Public and private sector preparedness for disasters often reproduces and creates further inequalities in disaster response and recovery through the unequal allocation of resources. As marginalised groups typically have less access to resources to prepare for disasters, they are more likely to experience severe physical and mental health outcomes and more likely to be physically displaced following disasters. The disaster recovery process, especially for marginalised people and groups, is often protracted, uneven and unjust. This poses a threat to democratic processes as the gaps between different groups widen, rupturing the social fabric of communities and especially disadvantaging people of colour, young and old people, and those already living in poverty. These inequalities can be compounded by top-down command and control, militaristic structures in disaster relief and recovery. Democratic principles are difficult to uphold during disasters, as government and emergency services often need to act quickly to protect lives and properties. However, emergency management processes that neglect democratic principles of equity, transparency, and inclusion can lead to maladaptation in disaster recovery, making affected communities more vulnerable to exploitation, especially those that are already disadvantaged or marginalised. For these reasons, community-led recovery is increasingly recognised as best practice in the emergency management sector in Australia. Community-led recovery is a strengths-based and collaborative approach to recovery that empowers individuals, families and the community to actively participate in their own recovery and is guided by the community's priorities. But community-led recovery requires a high level of structural support and resources, which are not always readily available. This makes these community-led principles difficult to realise on the ground. However, in my research, I've found that artistic programs that are underpinned by strong community engagement processes can stimulate community-led recovery, fostering democratic participation in disaster recovery processes and bridging divides between individuals and groups from a range of different backgrounds. By encouraging social connection and strengthening social capital, these projects build resilience in disaster-affected communities. They also promote individual psychological well-being by providing a means of expression that can help people make meaning of their experiences. Rather than sharing findings about the potential benefits of creative recovery projects to participants, I'll instead draw your attention to community engagement processes and how these intersected with public planning more broadly. To do so, I'll present a further 3 very condensed case studies of creative recovery following more recent wildfires in Australia. These cases have been constructed for my PhD thesis by bringing together data from interviews with artist project managers, focus groups with community members that have participated in these projects, and direct observations. The first case study I wanted to share with you is artist-led, which can be broadly understood to mean activities instigated by and led by artists to address social problems in collaboration with communities. As the name suggests, artists are the leading decision makers in these contexts, but artist-led projects are often initiated in the first instance by government bodies or other institutions through open calls for artists or funding programs that are designed to address specific issues. This was the case in an area called Cardinia Shire following eastern Victorian bushfires in February and March 2019, which burned 58 square miles of land, destroying 29 homes in and around the Bunyip State Park. In response to these wildfires, non-profit arts organisation, the Creative Recovery Network, launched a region-wide program to support community recovery and resilience building in partnership with 3 local governments. Interview participant, a multidisciplinary artist and creative director, Gulshen Oza, became involved as one of 8 creative recovery project leaders after responding to this call out for local artists. To develop project ideas, Oza explained that she spent time finding where people gathered to better understand key issues and difficulties, as well as what community members loved about where they lived. She met with community members at local venues and events, even visiting people at their properties and homes. Focus group participants said that this informal consultation process helped establish trust with community members before any specific project ideas were proposed. Drawing on her knowledge of the community's interests, Oza went on to propose an ambitious public artwork to local council. However, this was rejected due to the costs and controversies associated with major public art projects. Focus group members interpreted this as council misleading Oza by not establishing clear budgetary and project parameters. They were also aware that Oza and other local artists were not adequately remunerated for their extensive consultation work, and appeared frustrated and saddened by this. Recognising that there was more of a readiness to spend money on workshops with communities, Oza developed a new concept for a community choir project, which council then agreed to fund. The new project maintained the original themes and still aimed to address existing community divides. To attract participants to the project, Oza sought out a highly skilled and charismatic choir master named Stephen Taberner. Taberner was responsible for facilitating singing workshops, and Oza managed all other aspects of the project, including marketing via Facebook, community e-newsletters, in the post and in person. One man recalled that Oza cornered him in the pub and persuaded him to participate. And another focus group participant recalled his excitement at Taberner's involvement, explaining that the choir master's reputation for humour and talent is what attracted him to the project. However, other community members were more sceptical about becoming involved. One said that, initially when they said what they were going to do, I thought, you're crazy. There's other things that we need. Do we really need to sing together? Or do we really need to engage in some sort of crazy arts project? Despite their initial reservations, focus group participants explained that the combination of high artistic calibre, strong interpersonal skills, what they described as terrier-like tenacity, and professionalism of Taberna, Oza, and other creative recovery artists eventually converted these community members to creative recovery participants. Ultimately, Taberna and Oza delivered 4 free community singing workshops over two weeks, concluding with a free public performance for friends, family and the wider community in March 2021, which is 2 years after the initial fires. Additional workshops were also conducted with 2 existing local choirs and in local primary schools. A total of 200 community members participated in the project, with the main singing workshops attracting 40 participants. Taberna also composed a chorale work that incorporated words spoken by participants about their experiences of the fires. The group performed this song for the wider community, as well as recording it as part of a self-published CD. The public performance outcome was recognised as an additional catalyst for a lot of people to get together with people with different experiences. However, the group did acknowledge that for those in the community that, quote, that didn't participate, that the message didn't get to, or they didn't take it up to say that it was something they'd like to be involved in. There's still a lot of work to do to be done to convert those people into thinking that creative recovery might be of benefit. This suggests that there is likely a link between the involvement in the art-making process and the psychological engagement in artistic outputs. For those who are not involved in the choir, the social and emotional benefits may be more limited. The second case study I'd like to share with you is a community-led project from Beachmont in Queensland, a small town in the coastal hinterlands that was affected by wildfires in September 2019. Beachmont was among the first communities impacted by the ferocious 8-month-long Black Summer fire season in Australia. Interview participant, a small business owner and former theatre maker and arts manager, Jessica Townsend, recalled that in her street alone, more than half of her 20 neighbours lost their homes. Within 2 weeks of the fires, Townsend began developing ideas for community arts projects. By March 2020, local council had confirmed that Townsend Small Business would be granted funding for a creative recovery project. She also later received funding from 2 banks through their community programs, a philanthropic organisation, and the State Government Department of Communities, among others. Each funder supported a specific project within the overarching Regeneration Recovery Program, the details of which were developed in collaboration with her community. The community engagement process commenced early in the recovery process with an informal gathering at Townsend's home. There was an open invitation to local community members to come over for a cup of tea and bring a plate of food to share, with a few simple arts activities for adults and children set up in Townsend's yard. Townsend explained that approximately 100 community members attended, and they appeared supportive of future creative recovery projects. This inspired Townsend to form a voluntary project advisory group with fellow community members, as well as some invited representatives from local government and cultural sector leaders from the wider region. Townsend recognised that it was important to have transparent and rigorous governance processes underpinning the work of the advisory group, given the substantial public funding that she'd received. She was aware that, quote, people in the community are not always happy about the way money is allocated after natural disasters. She explained that one community member accused her of capitalising on their grief by seeking funding for projects. But despite scepticism from some community members, Townsend and the advisory group developed a mission, objective and deliverables for a 2-year creative recovery program that would be, quote, community-led, engage local artists, build local capacity and support the community through recovery and regeneration. After establishing these overarching aims, the advisory group then moved into further community consultation online via Facebook and email and in person. The advisory group also facilitated an expression of interest for community members, an expression of interest process for community members to indicate what kinds of projects they would like to be involved in personally. By gathering contact details through these consultation activities, the advisory group was then able to swiftly progress ideas with interested community leaders and local artists. Ultimately, the main artistic outputs were a documentary, 5 murals, a visual arts exhibition and artworks, and a community publication. Leadership for each project was devolved to fellow community members who were paid for their work. By supporting community leaders financially, the Regeneration Project avoided potential pitfalls of community-led recovery in relation to inadequate resourcing. An exception to this was Townsend as the program manager, who indicated that it was a lot of unpaid work for her personally. Once projects were underway, there were further avenues for community collaboration and participation, which varied from project to project. Both the documentary and publication process, local artist leaders interviewed fellow community members on camera or via audio recordings to capture their stories. In the exhibition project, local visual artists were invited to apply to a commissioning program to develop paintings and sculptures for a group exhibition, which the wider community could then view at a local gallery. Similarly, for the mural project, community members were invited to submit artwork proposals for 5 public murals. One focus group participant, who described herself as a pastry chef and closet artist, was commissioned to lead a mural project for the local rural fire service water tank. She explained that for other community members to participate, people didn't need to have an artistic bone in their body. All they were doing was putting paint on the spots, because the drawing was on the tank and it was like, all right, well, paint that, that's a tree. Here's some colours, do what you like. And so a lot of people were able to just come and put a bit of paint on the wall and leave, or stay and have a cup of tea. The range of informal and formal avenues for participation was deliberate. Another focus group participant stated that one of the messages in this project is that you don't have to be creative to be able to contribute your experience. And this has been changing people's perspectives about what art is. Yeah. However, some focus group participants reported instances of feeling triggered by other community members' artworks. One person explained that another local artist's work became distressing to her because he went from painting really lovely colours to black. This comment underlines the potential for artistic expression to have a negative impact on some community members. Overall, however, the group described a strong sense of community pride, confidence and independence as a result of the program. As one focus group participant said, Regeneration really instilled that we don't, as a community, have to go off the mountain. Everything we need is here. The third case I'd like to share with you was led by a local government-owned cultural institution called Fabric Arts and Heritage in the Adelaide Hills of South Australia. During the Black Summer bushfires in December 2019, 96.5 square miles burned during the Cuddly Creek wildfires, claiming 1 life and destroying 85 homes. At the time, Fabric Arts and Heritage had only recently been founded as a new local government-owned arts hub. Artistic Director of Fabric and interview participant Melinda Rankin explained that the organisation's original remit was to connect with local artists and the wider community, as well as attract tourists and visitors to the region through high-quality artistic programming. After the Cuddly Creek fires, however, Fabric volunteered to become a public recovery centre for the wider community, catalysing this organisation's pivot to creative recovery programming for the next 3 years. Their goals were to support community recovery by creating opportunities for connection, respite, perspective, and a sense of normality. They received financial support from local and state government recovery funds to support these aims. In the early stages of recovery, Rankin and her colleagues consulted with community members through informal discussions at the Recovery Centre, which helped them develop relationships with community members and become aware of their recovery needs more broadly. They also hired an arts and health expert from a nearby hospital program who visited the recovery/art centre to make suggestions to improve the often harsh recovery centre environment, to make it less chaotic and take a softer approach to the space aesthetically. This involved simplifying the whiteboard, removing high visibility or high vis clothing, providing appropriate reading materials, so no beautiful home magazines, putting calming artworks on the walls, and so on. Focus group participants explained that by embracing their role in community recovery early on, Fabric made their site familiar to locals as a place that you could go and get help from. This reputation for addressing community needs was reinforced through Fabric's provision of free venue support to both new and existing community groups. They also platformed the work of local community members and artists by programming their work alongside existing exhibitions and events. For example, during the touring exhibition of Solastalgia in early 2020, Fabric curated a local community member's large-scale charcoal drawing alongside the main exhibition. Fabric went on to regularly program community members' artistic works alongside those of professional artists from outside the community, including at the one-year Bushfire Anniversary Festival. By curating the programs in this way, focus group participants said they felt valued by Fabric. The professionalism and quality of Fabric programs both increased their appeal to community members as audiences and participants, while increasing their sense of connectedness to Fabric and to local government more broadly. Alongside their exhibitions and events program, Fabric also programmed a series of free, one-off and ongoing workshops. Among these were poetry writing and a wide range of visual arts and crafts workshops. Rankin prioritised hiring high-calibre artists who had strong community engagement skills so that both the artistic processes and the outputs were of high quality. Focus group participants concurred that the artistic professionalism and interpersonal skills of artist facilitators helped community members feel valued, respected and cared for. While the workshops where the artworks were created often took place privately and thereby enabled emotional expression and close social bonds to form, the artistic outputs of many of these workshops were exhibited publicly in community as part of community events. An example of this is the New Art for New Walls project, which was a painting workshop for families. Together, family members created new art to be hung on their newly rebuilt walls at home. These artworks were also exhibited to the wider community in shopfront windows as part of the South Australian Living Artists Festival, with one participant saying this made her feel more visible to those in the community that hadn't lost their homes. She also said that it was probably the first of those activities that, quote, kind of had that message of hope or that message of moving on, that one day you would have a wall to put it on. Fabric also ensured that qualified counsellors were present at Fabric events, which was enabled by funding from state government health agency Wellbeing South Australia. At one of Fabric events, I observed Rankin's pre-show welcome speech, during which he directed audience members' attention to the counsellor in attendance, should anyone need one. The counsellor participated as a quasi-audience member throughout the performance, which involved a 2.3 kilometre or I think how many miles that is, 2.3 kilometre guided walk through the fire-affected bushland park with live immersive performance elements. The counsellor subtly observed other audience members while making polite conversation. This approach gave the impression of openness and readiness without imposing on audience members. One focus group participant reflected that the presence of counsellors at Fabric events became a first port of call for accessing professional mental health advice when other recovery-related psychology services had been withdrawn from the community. Observing the counsellor's presence at understory, I could understand how approachable and convenient this must have been for these community members, especially those who participated regularly in Fabric events. After 3 years of continuous creative recovery programming, one participant described Fabric's work as, quote, the longest staying recovery process in the community. Collectively, focus group participants strongly advocated for the continuation of Fabric's creative recovery program, especially for community members that had lost their homes. At the time of my fieldwork, it remained to be seen to what extent Fabric would be able to continue their recovery adjacent work. However, the connection and appreciation that community members felt towards Fabric as a local government organisation appeared set to continue long into the future. To summarise, across the 4 case studies I shared, creative recovery often blurred the lines between public and private spaces. And many of these spaces were regulated or controlled by government entities that relaxed their usual expectations for users. The combination of public and private participation and community engagement was complementary across the case studies. Public consultations increased community awareness and participation in projects, and private participation options created safe spaces for community members to connect with one another and express difficult emotions. Through public exhibitions and performances, the artistic outputs that were created privately could be shared with the wider public, and this contributed to a sense of community pride, cohesiveness, and resilience. In the future, some of you in this room may have the capacity to influence public planning decisions in relation to these kinds of projects. This could be in regard to funding and in-kind non-monetary resources, such as access to venues and other amenities, or even planning permissions for public art projects. Some of you may be interested in participating or developing these kinds of programs with LA communities that have been affected by wildfires. My hope is that through this presentation, I've given you a clear sense of how these projects can develop and evolve, gaining momentum as more and more community members begin to recognise the benefits of expressing themselves through creativity and finding connection with others through shared artistic activities. I also hope that I've demonstrated how these projects intersect with the public realm, both via community engagement processes, as well as the resultant public planning and resourcing arrangements. If there's time, I'm happy to take any questions you might have, and thank you very much for having me and listening.
I'm supposed to be the moderator now, for better or worse. So I have one question, and then I'm going to throw it over to you guys. So Anna, you've been here for a week. I'm just wondering if you've seen any socially engaged art around or any of these kinds of practices emerging in Los Angeles in response to the fires.
Yeah, definitely. I've been connecting with LA Commons, who often work with the Black community around Leimert Park. And they are developing a project with the Altadena community for their festival, combining their kind of usual Festival of Masks program and then collaborating on a future program there. So they're doing some work. There's also a group, an organisation called, I think it's the Armory Centre. I'm just going to double check.
Yeah, it is the Armory in Pasadena.
Yeah. So they've been doing a lot of work, relief programs with and for community there. And I've also heard of one-off different events like the Atricum Botanicum in Topanga did a Welcome Home Topanga event after when people were able to return to their homes after being evacuated. So there's definitely these kinds of projects happening in LA in response to the wildfires. But my inkling is that because in Australia this kind of practice has been more consistently resourced by government through public funding for arts and culture, there's been maybe more consistent documentation over the past couple of decades for these sorts of projects. So that's my sense of why there might not be more information available about previous and current events.
When you mentioned government, I'm kind of curious because of what's going on in the US. Some strategies or ways that you feel we could be encouraged to make parallels between arts-based practices and what the purpose is of trauma and healing, but maybe some of the censorship that we're dealing with when it comes to being able to validate or come up with, reasons for why we need to continue doing that. So just in the government strategy, I'm curious if you had any, ideas as you're watching us navigate this.
Yeah, in the Australian context, we have an advocacy organisation called the Creative Recovery Network, and they've spent a lot of time engaging with the emergency management sector to advocate for the value of the arts in disaster recovery. And increasingly, there's recognition from the emergency management sector that we need to consider not only the needs of physically rebuilding spaces, but also the social and emotional or psychological needs of affected community members. So one of the frameworks that I've been using in my research is looking at psychosocial recovery and framing the arts as a method to encourage that psychosocial recovery, and also using that terminology around community-led recovery and community resilience has been useful in the Australian context in recovery, because those are things that the emergency sector wants to encourage but doesn't always know or have the methodologies to do so. So it's harder to translate it to the US context because there's more privatisation here, and so these kinds of funding programs or government-led recovery initiatives differ because the private sector is much more involved in a way that we don't see in Australia. But certainly from a public policy perspective, the Creative Recovery Network has been advocating for planning ahead for the involvement of the arts and cultural sector through recovery plans and recovery policies as part of this psychosocial recovery effort more broadly.
Hey, thanks for speaking to us. I had a question about the, I guess, conversation that, or if there's much back and forth between this like immediacy of needing to rebuild and like the creative side of like arts as a recovery process. 'Cause you may have seen from, at least on a lot of the conversations in LA, a lot of it is very like building real estate focused.
Yeah.
And in your own experience, have you seen any sort of kind of pathway where the arts process kind of addresses the way we rebuild? Because, you know, there's a lot of questions in LA about how we build back better. And are there opportunities where the arts process can inform, like change, like that perspective shift that needs to happen? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, there are, I would say, more so indirectly than directly from what I've seen in my case studies. The indirect ways in which the arts can contribute to this process is through building social capital. So through my research, I found that artistic programs can increase bonding capital, so bonding social capital, so between people who are already connected, like families or friends, bridging capital, so between different groups, dissimilar groups and people, and also linking capital, which is the connection between community members and power holders or authorities. So these kinds of projects have the potential to stimulate that capital. There's also, depending on how it's facilitated and the mindfulness and the community engagement process is used. So if there are poorer processes, it's possible for these projects to negatively impact those forms of capital as well. But through these rigorous community engagement processes, people build social capital, which means they have access to more information and resources. And so when it comes to collective action or collective efforts to advocate for communities and what they want, if they're better connected, they're better able to do that kind of advocacy work. So that's a kind of indirect connection. And then the other thing that came to mind is the potential of the arts to help people imagine and envisage the future that they'd like to see. And that's something that came through a little bit in the Strath-UN project that I introduced early in the conversation around inviting community members to reflect on the future of their community and what they would like to see happen moving forward and moving into a life beyond the fires. So quite a few of my interview participants talked about how the arts can help people see that there's a life beyond the fires and start to be able to imagine what that might look like.
I'm a first year MEP student as well. I saw the case studies that you presented. I guess with me, my question would be more sort of geared towards timing.
Yeah.
I know that, when disasters like that happen, people, the immediate action that they want is, like you said, the recovery and the assessment. I'm just wondering what, if you can speak on it, but what did you see in regards to the engagement of the timing of those disasters happening and the community, whether it was facilitated by way of government or organically, that starting to take shape? Was it immediately after? Was it, a few months, a year? What was the time frame? If you can speak to that in regards to some of those.
Yeah, totally. So to frame it in the context of recovery more broadly, a model that's used a lot in Australia that might also be replicated here is the PPRR model, which is preparedness, which is about preparedness, relief, and recovery. So the relief phase is kind of obvious. It's the first, week or two when people are attending to their immediate basic needs, and then the recovery process. Formal arrangements often last for about a year, and then start slowly being withdrawn. And these kinds of projects can last 3 to 5 years. So that's the kind of overarching context. That's complexified now by compounding disaster impacts and sometimes cascading disasters. So compounding multiple disaster events happening in quick succession, and then cascading one disaster causing another disaster, causing another disaster. Timing is complex just in that respect alone, but then also different individuals and different groups recover at different rates. Generally and broadly, those who've lost their homes in my research, tend to take them longer, but again, it's an individual thing. Depending on whether that artist or organisation already has a relationship with particular communities or is a community member themselves, somewhat influences the timing. I've seen organisations like Fabric be present immediately by providing their venue as a recovery centre and then doing more relief activities, and that's something that's been happening at Octavia's bookstore in Altadena and also at the Armory Centre. So you'll see these arts organisations just kind of pivot their activities to be involved in relief. In those instances, certainly in the case of Fabric, that was an opportunity to learn about what the community themselves needed and were experiencing. And so they were able to start to adjust the activities they were doing to reflect and respond to community interests, and that was within their remit as an arts organisation. Individual artists have often done kind of informal or sort of gentle and quite humble and generous gifting activities relatively early in the recovery process. And that has typically helped make people a bit more open to other more complex or larger scale project ideas as recovery processes evolved. But for people entering into the community, there is a tension between the later you leave it and the fewer other services that are available to people, the more hostility that can emerge because people feel like their needs are no longer being met. And then if someone's coming in with an arts project, it can feel like a disconnect between what is needed and what is happening or being funded. So ideally, building those relationships earlier through serving the community in whatever way is a way in which that can be addressed. But often communities are ready kind of by the 1 year anniversary to have some sort of commemorative event. Although, like I said before, it really varies from person to person and group to group. And there's still many people who choose not to participate in something like this even after a year or sometimes 2 or 3 years. But I've also had focus group participants say that they want these kinds of programs to continue beyond the 3-year point because sometimes it's at that stage that people are actually ready to engage in kind of processing some of what they've experienced. So a good question, but a complex challenge.
I have another question. Yeah. You may have answered this, but wondering if any of the groups that you studied or engaged with moved on to prevention kind of activities as opposed to just recovery and repair.
I guess prevention, it depends on like what way you're looking at the kind of prevention activities. If it's a very kind of literal, how do we kind of physically adapt, then I haven't seen much evidence of that. But it's what I have seen evidence of is that argument that the social capital that's built through these kinds of projects is something that extends far beyond the life of the recovery process and can be protective for communities in the lead up to upcoming disasters. And I've also heard anecdotal evidence from arts managers and leaders in this space that artistic communities tend to be a bit more well-connected as it is, and they often deploy their resources into this space. But that is an emerging area of development that the Creative Recovery Network is increasingly advocating for in Australia, but there's still limited research on that aspect of prevention and preparedness in this space, yeah.
This may be a little bit off the mark from a lot of the research that you've done, but one of the issues that some of us are thinking about is how can community engagement, particularly of the arts, encourage people who might be on the fence as to whether to return or to stay in the community or to come back to a community?
Yeah, and that's something I've seen in the research. Many people are physically displaced and living outside of that area. And yet, because of the presence of these different arts projects, so the Letterbox project, but also there was a community knitting project and the Tree project, meant that even though people were physically displaced, they returned to the community to participate and connect with people who'd had similar experiences. And that's something that I heard a lot, is that people valued this opportunity to just be in the presence of other people who'd experienced what they've been through, but have something often tactile to do with their hands that they found emotionally regulating. And with people who they didn't have to talk if they didn't want to talk, they could if they wanted to. So yeah, those kinds of activities, that bonding can really bring people back and want to stay in the community.
Do you, disaster make devastation affect people? Can we see the same things, the same effect to the artist or researcher like you? You know, when you were working, how did you feel?
I put a lot of protocols in place for me as a researcher to protect my own well-being when conducting this research. Part of that process was debriefing with my supervisors. I have a couple of supervisors who are disaster researchers and practitioners. So I organised with them, particularly after focus groups with community members, to have debriefs. And I also am privileged enough to be able to practice self-care and don't have any dependents. And so I'm in a position where I'm, have that time and ability to do that, which is a challenge for a lot of people working in this space that I personally didn't have to contend with to the same extent. For artists and project managers, often in that dual role of both lead facilitating artist and project manager, there is a risk of vicarious trauma, because the arts is being used as a medium through which to filter these stories. And often, particularly in the earlier stages of recovery, people really want to be witnessed and be heard and have their experiences understood. And so there is a lot of storytelling that happens in that space, and artists often are there in that position holding space, and they see the interview participants in my research have seen that as part of their job and their responsibility. So that emotional labour is certainly part of the role. And then they also are bringing their artistic skills and their administrative and project management skills. So it's quite a complex space to work in. And because artists working with communities tend to be under-resourced and underfunded, there's also financial strain experienced by these artists and arts workers. So that's one of the reasons that things like planning ahead for the arts and culture and the potential of these sorts of programs as part of the broader recovery process can be really useful, because then arts appropriate funding pathways can become better established. And although it doesn't solve all the problems, remunerating artists appropriately for their work, particularly the time spent engaging with communities, but also providing access to networks. So different existing arts organisations can facilitate those peer-to-peer networks and support structures, and can also help facilitate training, so trauma-informed care training and a bit more understanding and awareness of how communities are affected by disasters and what their experiences are. But yes, broadly, that is a significant challenge for this workforce.
I feel like the front row needs to ask a question, and then we can wrap this up. Just saying.
I do have a question, but I'm trying to think it through, but you sort of just, I guess, acknowledged it. also, I'm Takoria, I'm also first year MUP, but I was in creative and performing arts for throughout middle school and high school. So this is sort of personal to like my experience. I guess since I grew up in it, and since these fires have happened, I guess every few years or so, have you noticed any like changes in people that have grown up experiencing this? Like maybe if you witnessed a fire or experienced that trauma when you were younger, and then there was a community development or community artwork program when you were younger, and then it happened when you were older as well. Have you noticed, or I guess seen any changes in those people where I guess their experience with art has changed, or they only relate art to trauma experiences or community development projects?
Interesting. I haven't seen any specific evidence of that. The best example I can think of though is the community of the Northern Rivers of New South Wales in Australia, a very flood-prone community. And so artists working there are much more consistently working in this creative recovery context. Although it's only recently that this kind of terminology has proliferated to the degree that they're describing their work in that way. And in those cases, I mean, I'm yet to be able to conduct longitudinal research here, and there's a paucity of research in this field more broadly. So the observations I can make is less so about the ways in which maybe children and young people might experience these projects and how that might inform their views of the arts and culture later, but more so in relation to how the tone and content of artistic works has shifted over time in response to these increasing impacts of disasters. So one of my interview participants in Lismore talked about how previously they were able to create performances that were using mud as materials for like a dance performance in bathtubs in a kind of big public forum, and how that kind of performance would not be appropriate 5 years later after their more recent flooding experiences because of the level of trauma in that community and how much more impactful that particular disaster was. So there is definitely a shift in the kind of broader conversation, thinking and sensing what community needs and will respond to and benefit from now compared to even a few years ago with the increasing impacts and frequency of disasters. Yeah.
A lot of our students are really interested, and I've become more interested as well, in like the access through mobility and transportation, and especially how it ties through these movements, right, where people have to adapt and adjust based on the wildfires and other natural disasters. So I was wondering what you could share about what you've seen within these communities, because I could tell these are like representing a lot of paths and opportunities for people to navigate. So I wonder how that kind of ties in.
Do you mean like literal transport, or?
I think it's just, I think more of like people movements through these communities, like how, like, do people bike? Do they now, like, has that impacted that way of just kind of living life on a daily basis?
Yeah, a lot of the communities that I've researched are rural communities, and so they're very poorly serviced by public transport in most instances, and usually too spread out to support biking or walking kinds of lifestyles. So transport by car is still the most common, although it's quite common for these kinds of arts projects to organise buses and other forms of transportation that can get groups to events, recognising that sometimes people lose their vehicles in disasters and might also be under financial strain, or even just the debris on the road means that their tyres get punctured every other day, and so they need to have alternative methods of transportation. So there are those kinds of methods of like specially organised transportation, shuttle buses and the like happen during these kinds of projects, but particularly in rural communities in Australia, it's a very car-centric transport system. Lismore is a bit of an exception to that because it's a larger city centre in the Northern Rivers, the flood-affected area. And community members talk to me a lot about because it was dangerous to get on the roads, or because they might have been divided with floodwaters and only be able to go, up the hill instead of back down. That's something that really impacted their capacity to participate in these kinds of programs. And so sometimes it was literally that there was a physical barrier preventing them from participating. And that once that transport was enabled, then they could start to engage a bit more in community recovery, even though that desire was there prior to that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anna, so much.
Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.